Expansive History of European Opera Part 9 of 32. These 32 talks feature 177 operas and 116 composers over 4 centuries and from 12 countries. The Age of Romanticism Part 1. First, an introduction to the Age of Romanticism, then this talk features grand opera with excerpts from grand opera. Here is a wide introduction that I will in later talks departmentalize and apply segments of this introduction to the very different types of Romanticism featured in a number of the following talks separately devoted to grand opera: Italian bel canto, German opera, opera in Russia, opera in Poland, opera in England. The many composers referred to in this long introduction will all be featured in the separate talks to follow. Romanticism in opera is almost indefinable because of its extreme variety and contrasts. Beethoven looking back to Mozart, gigantic French grand opera unlike opera in other countries, Italian bel canto imitated by some German composers, also in Germany, Weber breaking new ground and paving the way for Wagner and many other composers expressing their ideas, not only in Italy, France and Germany but also in other European countries. Romanticism is not so much a precise concept as a swarm of ideas that coalesce in combinations that vary from country to country and from artist to artist. Certain notions dominate the opera of the Romantic Age: the beauty and terror of nature, the power and ubiquity of supernatural forces, as in Der Friesshutz by Weber, as one example, the purity of the rural life, an idealized vision of the Middle Ages, the concepts of liberty and fraternity, as in Fidelio by Beethoven, as one example. But as with all great cultural epochs, the Age of Romanticism has as many histories as it has historians. Now, breaking away from this long introduction to and description of Romanticism to which I shall return, here is my first example of grand opera, one feature of Romanticism in opera. Grand opera. The golden age of grand opera was 1828 to 1850. As I said before, in any account of the subject, the two French revolutions looms large, and the events of 1789 are a good point from which to begin an overview of Romantic opera. There was also a Belgian Revolution of 1830 and the Second French Revolution of July 1830. The Second French Revolution, the July 1830 French Revolution, which lasted 3 days, saw the overthrow of King Charles X, the French Bourbon monarch, and the ascent of his cousin Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans, who himself, after 18 precarious years on the throne, would in turn be overthrown in 1848. Les Muettes de Portici, also known as Masaniello, 1830, by Daniel François Spriorba, was revolutionary. The opera was performed on the night of the outbreak of the Belgian Revolution of 1830, and it was the first opera played after the French July Revolution of 1830. Wagner wrote in 1871 in his Reminiscences of Orba, quote, "With this opera, Orba was recognized as an obvious precursor of the July Revolution, and seldom has an artistic product stood in closer connection with the world event." The opera was the first true French grand opera, a serious work in 5 acts, based on a historical event, with spectacular events, couleur locale, choruses and ballet. Wagner wrote, quote, "Such a vivid operatic subject was a complete novelty, the first real drama in 5 acts with all the attributes of a genuine tragedy, down to the actual tragic ending." Each of these 5 acts presented a drastic picture of the greatest vivacity, in which arias and duets in the conventional operatic sense were scarcely to be detected anymore, or at least, with the exception of the prima donna's aria in the first act, no longer had this effect. Now it was the entire act as a larger ensemble that gripped one and carried one away. The opera plot. Naples, 1647. The Spanish control Naples. Alfonso, the viceroy's son, has seduced and abandoned Fenella, a Neapolitan maiden. Her brother, the fisherman Masaniello, leads a revolution against the Spanish. Masaniello is crowned king of Naples but is murdered by his fellow conspirators, and Fenella throws herself off a balcony as Vesuvius erupts. Here is the first excerpt from Le Muette de Portici by Daniel Francois Espriorba. Before tragedy strikes, here is a lighter excerpt. The market of Naples is open for business. Excerpt 1. Here is the second excerpt, the finale. Alfonso leads the Spanish troops to crush the revolution. Masaniello has been poisoned by Barilla, but recovers enough to muster his men. Fenella remains behind and is found by Elvire and Alphonse, who tell her that Masaniello has been killed trying to protect Elvire from the masses. In despair, Fenella throws herself from the parapet of the palace, as Vesuvius erupts in the background. Excerpt 2. Now returning to this introduction to and description of Romanticism. In any account of the subject, however, the French Revolution looms large, and the events of 1789 are a good point from which to begin an overview of Romantic opera. Many of the profound social changes of the Revolution were reflected in the music of the period. The opera house was now perceived in terms of its appeal to the people, not to the aristocracy, and operatic subject matter assumed the ideologies of post-aristocratic France. Composers like Grétry produced a stream of patriotic and uplifting dramas, many of them focusing on the rescue of an innocent from the forces of oppression. The feature of the rescue of an innocent from the forces of oppression. Judged in terms of quality, the apex was reached not in France but in Germany, with Fidelio by Ludwig van Beethoven, the first composer to whom the label Romantic was applied. Beethoven's Fidelio is among the century's most important operas, standing as opera's most powerful embodiment of the idealism of the new democratic age. The novelty of Fidelio lies in its ideas rather than in its musical fabric, for in its general structure it looks back to the classic order of Mozart. In Germany, Beethoven was the great figurehead of Romantic culture, but the formula negation of a distinctly German form of Romantic opera was largely the work of other composers. Outstanding among these were the polytalented E.T.A. Hoffmann, whose Undine drew much of its strength from its use of German folk song, Louis Spohr, in whose Faust you can trace the ancestry of Wagner's music dramas, and, above all, Carl Maria von Weber, whose Der Freischütz is the quintessential German Romantic opera, with its melding of the bucolic and the supernatural. After Weber there's something of a lull in the story of German opera, with only Heinrich Marschner doing anything to further Weber's experiments prior to the emergence of Richard Wagner. Friedrich von Flotow, Otto Nicolai, Albert Lortzing and Peter Cornelius all experienced greater success with their comedies, largely as a result of their ability to assimilate aspects of the increasingly popular bel canto Italian style of opera. Now, returning to grand opera. The giganticism that could be taken to be a defining aspect of Romantic opera was again a product of France, where grand opera, as it became known in the 1840s, was fathered by the likes of Cherubini and Luigi Spontini, both of them Italian composers who spent much of their lives in France. Here is an aria from Leah Benseridge's, 1813, by Cherubini sung by Alagna. In this aria Almanzo has won an important battle but lost the flag, which he must retrieve. Excerpt 3. In France, grand opera was fathered also by the likes of Luigi Spontini, also an Italian composer who spent much of his life in France. For La Vestal, the Vestal Virgin, 1807, by Gaspar Spontini, the success was unprecedented. The first production ran for 200 performances. The critics hailed the coming of the most significant work of the decade, while Napoleonic France gained a musical symbol. The opera plot. The victorious Roman general Licinius intends to kidnap Julia, the priestess of Vesta whom he loves. Julia prays to Vesta to resist temptation, but yields to him in the temple of Vesta. The sacred flame dies out, and Licinius flees. The high priest sentences Julia to death for licentiousness, but she refuses to name her lover. A stroke of lightning relights the sacred flame. The high priest and chief Vestal interpret this as an omen, and free Julia, who marries Licinius. End of opera plot. Without the Emperor Napoleon's command and Josephine's wish, Spontini's masterpiece would never have been produced. The jury of the opera found its style eccentric, the harmony defective, the orchestration noisy, certain phrases completely unintelligible, while the vocal line rested on the accompaniment like a fistful of hair on a bowl of soup. Spontini had to endure the editing of two mediocre musicians, Persuise and Ray, before the opera could be staged, but the work was, as Napoleon predicted, a success. The Institut de France declared it the best lyrical work of the decade. It received nearly 100 consecutive performances, and 200 performances by 1830. Wagner and Berlioz admired the opera. Spontini, Berlioz declared, was the genius of the century. Napoleon declared, "Your opera will obtain a great success, it deserves it. Your opera abounds in new motifs, the declamation is true and agrees with the musical emotion, beautiful arias, effective duos, a stirring finale, the Marquis du Supplice is admirable." Here is another glowing review of his operas by a music critic. Spontini was, first and foremost, a dramatic composer, whose inspiration grew with the importance of the situations, with the warmth of the emotions, with the violence of the passions he depicted. From these Spontini's prodigious and sudden explosion of genius in La Vestale, that torrent of ardent ideas, those heartfelt tears, that stream of melodies, noble, touching, proud, and menacing, those warmly colored harmonies, those unheard-of modulations, that young orchestra armed in the antique manner, and that truth, that deepness in the expression and that wealth of great musical images, imposed with magisterial authority, so naturally embracing the poet's thought with such force that one cannot conceive that they could ever be separated from the words to which they have been adapted. End quote. Here is the excerpt from La Vestale, the Vestal Virgin, by Gaspar Spontini. Julia has let the sacred flame of Vesta go out. The crowd outside the temple demands vengeance. In the confusion, Julia insists that Licinius escapes, which he does with the help of his friend Cinna. Refusing to name the man who broke in to distract her, Julia takes full responsibility for allowing the sacred flame to be extinguished. While he escapes, the Pontifex Maximus strips her of her insignia and sentences her to death. After this excerpt, later in the opera Julia is about to be executed when lightning strikes and the flame is renewed. This is taken as a sign of divine intervention on her behalf, and she and Licinius, whose attempts to exonerate her have failed, are reunited. Excerpt 4. Back to the introduction of Romantic opera. The composer responsible for the revitalization of Italy's musical culture was Gioacchino Rossini, who rapidly developed a flexibly formulaic style of composition that virtually invited imitators. Equally adept as the creator of comedies, Tu Barbiere di Sevilla, and grandiose melodramas, Guillaume Tell, Rossini exercised a profound influence across Europe. But at home he was espinaggiously important to the art of bel canto, beautiful song, the seminal genre of Italian Romanticism. Along with Rossini, the two composers with whom bel canto is most closely associated are Gaetano Donizetti and Vincenzo Bellini, both of whom wrote highly dramatic operas in which the bulk of the emotional freight was carried by the vocal line, whereas in German opera the orchestra was emerging as the dominant partner. At its weakest, bel canto amounted to little more than floridly pretty music applied to a weak plot and inane libretto, but although the hugely prolific Donizetti was culpable of spinning a fair amount of musical candy floss, the same could not be said of Bellini, who often applied himself assiduously to the setting of the texts he used. Though British writers were preeminent in the Romantic era, the country's composers were, at best, peripheral. The lone success was the Irishman Michael Balfe, who applied his ballad writing skill to some of the daftest libretti ever set to music. The early operas of Verdi are omitted from the Age of Romanticism as Verdi's operas are featured in a later talk in the series on Verdi, Wagner and their contemporaries. If you think you have not seen a grand opera and want to imagine one, jump ahead many decades to 1871 and think of Aida being performed with a cast of hundreds at the Verona Arena. The typical grand opera composer took an episode from history, padded it out to 5-act length, inserted a few ballet sequences, and created plenty of opportunities for cast of dozens, choruses and lavish scenographic effects. This genre, the enduring influence of which can be seen in works as dissimilar as Verdi's Aida and Wagner's Götterdämmerung, was further developed by Daniel Auber, the first French-born composer of grand opera, and reached its intemperate maturity with the collaborative efforts of the poet Eugene Scribe and the composer Giacomo Meyerbeer. In their hands grand opera became a form in which discretion was tantamount to treason. For example, for the premiere of Meyerbeer's Le Prophète, one scene was accompanied by a 22-piece on-stage band, the opera's stage was lit by electric light for the first time, and the effect of a frozen lake was achieved by the cast sliding about on roller skates. Yet between these eye-popping scenes Meyerbeer threaded some exquisitely beautiful music. In its combination of high melodrama and tuneful melancholy, Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots stands as one of the finest examples of pure grand opera, alongside La Joie, the Jewess, by the emulator of Meyerbeer, Fromental-Olevi. Here are excerpts from Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots. In Part 2, the next talk, I will play excerpts from Fromental-Olevi's La Joie, the Jewess. Now, Les Huguenots, 1836, by Meyerbeer. It starts almost light-heartedly, close to opera comique or Rossini, and ends in blackest tragedy, with music anticipating Verdi. The opera plot. The action takes place in the Touraine region, and then in Paris, in 1572, during a religious war between Catholics and Protestants. A Huguenot, Raoul de Nangis, has met a mysterious woman, who he has rescued and fallen in love with. He does not know at the time that Valentine, the daughter of Street Briss, is a Catholic and Marguerite de Valois lady-in-waiting. She is also engaged to marry the Count of Nevers. From her castle in Chenonceau, Marguerite de Valois hopes to bring the two religions together. To achieve this, she orders Raoul to marry Valentine. However, convinced that Valentine is still engaged to Nevers, when in fact the engagement has been broken off, Raoul refuses to comply, provoking the Catholic sire. The young Huguenot dies in the street Bartholomew's Day massacre, along with Valentine, who, after converting to Protestantism in order to marry Raoul, is killed by her own father. The first of 3 excerpts from Les Huguenots. See translation video. Sung by Nikolai Gedda and Maddie Mesplay. Excerpt 5. The second excerpt from Les Huguenots. See translation video. Sung by Frederica von Stade. Excerpt 6. The third excerpt. The Blessing of the Swords. The Catholic conspirators, led by the Comte de Saint-Brice, plot to massacre the Huguenots. Priests bless the assassins, and tell them that God wills the murders. Berlioz called the blessing of the swords one of the most shattering inspirations in the whole of the art. See translation video. Excerpt 7.